and welcome to Writers Showcase. I'm your host, Christie Stratos, author of Anatomy of a Darkened Heart and Brotherhood of Secrets. I also have my own editing company, which you can find at proofpositivepro.com. And this show is part of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. Today, I am welcoming prolific science fiction, fantasy, and nonfiction author, among other things. He's multi-talented. Edward Willett, back to the show. Thank you so much for being here, Ed.
Thanks for having me on again. I didn't scare you off the first time, so that's good.
It's always a pleasure talking to you. You have so much going on that it's actually hard to decide where to start, but I would like to start with your latest book, which is Master of the Worlds. It is the second book in the Worldshapers series. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Oh, look, I have a copy right here. This is what it looks like. There we go.
Coincidence. Try
not to hold it in front of my face. Master of the World is book 2 in the Worldshapers series. Book 1 was Worldshaper, duh. It's set in a world of a labyrinth, a sort of an extra-dimensional labyrinth in which there are studded, rather like chocolate chips in a muffin, as the character makes the analogy at some point, worlds that are shaped by the people that live in them. So it's sort of like authors living inside the worlds that they create. What they have in common is that they all learned how to shape these worlds in our world, and then were let loose in the labyrinth by a mysterious woman named Ygritte. My main character's name is Shauna Keys. She has a very ordinary seeming life. She's starting a new pottery studio in a small Montana town. But strange things start happening. A mysterious stranger makes an appearance, and then all of a sudden there's a terrible attack on a local coffee shop that she's in. Her best friend is killed. A bunch of other people are killed. She can't believe it's happening, and just like that, it didn't happen. It hasn't happened. It never did happen, except everybody that died is not only still not there, nobody even remembers that they ever existed. Mm. This raises some questions, which the mysterious stranger is able to answer, Carl Yatzer. He tells her that an adversary has come into her world, that she's the shaper of this world. She's supposed to remember she's the shaper, but she can't, and tells her that she has so much power, as she just proved by resetting time, that he thinks she can rescue all of the worlds in the labyrinth from this adversary who's going from world to world and trying to take them over, and is trying to get to Ygritte and destroy the whole labyrinth. So the first book is largely them escaping, spoiler, escaping because there wouldn't be any more books if they didn't escaping the adversary from her world. And then in the second book, Master of the World, for the first time, she's in another shaper's world. And it's a world that was inspired by Jules Verne. So it's a very steampunky world with submarines and airships and floating islands. And I just had a lot of fun with it. And in this one, she's separated from Carl for most of the book, so she has to find her own way through the maze of competing interests in this world and try to figure out who the shaper is and get to the shaper, because she's supposed to gather his knowledge and then carry it through all the worlds until she eventually gets to Ygritte and saves the labyrinth.
Wow. So is this young adult, but also, of course, I'm sure adults would appreciate it, or did you say young adult, or is it not?
It's not young adult, although oddly enough, it was longlisted for a Starburst Award, which is a juried Canadian science fiction fantasy award, in the young adult category. And I'm not sure why, because Shauna is specifically said to be 27 years old, and there's comments in the beginning of how she's older than some of the college students and so forth in her town. And there are no teenagers in the book at all, but it for some reason it got longlisted as a young adult book. But it is actually published in the adult market and not in the young adult market. But it is young adult friendly. Any teen reader can read this book and would, I think, enjoy it.
Yeah, it sounds like it would appeal to almost anyone. I love the idea of being a world shaper, a world creator, or something like that, and being inside not just, your world, and then someone else's, and trying to figure out like what have they done here, or something along those lines. That sounds pretty incredible. Have you ever read any of the Myst books? I know they're older. Probably nobody even knows what they are anymore.
Well, I remember Myst as a computer game.
Yeah.
And is that what the books are based on?
Yes, it is based on that. And it's been a while since I read them, but there was something about this father figure who was going to these different worlds and trying to alter them. So it just, sparked that memory for me, but it sounds quite different. And I really like the idea of it. How did you come up with the concept of like creating these worlds and then hopping around to the different ones, and like that they're all totally different. It sounds like one seems either is Earth or more like Earth, and then another one is more steampunk type. I really like that idea.
It's a little hard for you to remember exactly where it came from. But I believe it was a fairly, not exactly cold-blooded, but I wanted to write a lot. I rather proudly think that I can write just about anything. So I wanted to write stories that could be set in any kind of world, but I wanted to put them into a series so I'd have a continuing character. And so the idea was to come up with an idea where I could write a steampunk book and a high fantasy book and a film noir book, and for all I know, a My Little Pony book down the road, probably. And so that was where the idea came from. And originally it was quite different because it was very straightforward fantasy, and it took place in a kind of a valley, maybe like the Riverworld, Philip Jose Farmer's Riverworld, sort of, where it just goes on and on and on and on, and there are different side valleys, and each one of them would have like a cave at the end of it. If you went into the cave, you'd be in another world. That was the original premise, but over time it evolved, and now it actually, although it sounds like a fantasy, it actually has a science fictional background. But the whole idea from the beginning was to come up with a concept. The other thing I compare it to is Doctor Who. Doctor Who has the greatest storytelling conceit ever come up with, because time and relative dimensions in space, any story, anywhere that you can imagine, in the here and now, or any time in history, or anywhere in outer space, or in alternate worlds, you can all tell it within the Doctor Who framework. And I wanted to kind of come up with an idea like that would let me tell lots of stories in lots of different styles and lots of different worlds. Our world is in the background, but nothing ever takes place in our world except in people's memories. Shonda's world is very much like ours, but it's not quite ours. Lacrosse is the big professional sport. College kite fighting is very popular. There are colonies on the moon. Shauna has been in the world, shaped the world 10 years ago, although she doesn't remember it. 10 years ago, peace started breaking out all over, because that's the kind of world she wanted. And there's little things like, instead of Netflix, there's Stream Picks, and instead of iPhones, people have high phones. And I had a lot of fun coming up with some of that stuff as well.
I can imagine. That's,
the president is a woman and lives in the Emerald Palace, not in the White House.
Yeah, Emerald Palace. I love that. This sounds kind of like a perfect thing that you've created. I know that as an author, sometimes if I want to stick with my, I write Victorian fiction. So sometimes it can be frustrating because that's really what I'm related to, Victorian fiction. And sometimes I might want to write something else, but my main series is Victorian. It sounds like you've come up with a perfect solution to be able to write, like you said, if you wanted to hop into something more noir, you could, which is coincidental that you say that, because I've always wanted to write something more like that. But it's so far off from anything that I publish that I worry a bit about branding. But in this way, you don't have to worry about branding. So that was pretty smart.
Yeah, it still is. It's all science. Well, yeah, science fiction fantasy, because it reads like fantasy, but has this kind of science fiction backstory with aliens and nanotech and everything that made all this happen in this extra dimensional thing. It's really science fiction. Everybody reads it like fantasy, so I never know quite what to call it. But yeah, by setting it within that, it's still within what I'm known for, I guess, fantasy and science fiction. And it has that continuing character, and it is a way. I mean, I could write all of these books separately, and they'd all be standalones or whatever. But this way, you hopefully have a continuity of readers that will follow you into all those other worlds. Whereas if I just suddenly put out a Victorian romance novel, it would be a startling thing.
Yeah. That's true, but I do think that, at least for me, when I'm reading fantasy or sci-fi, the whole point is to visit these different worlds and just different landscapes, anything that's just totally different. And so the idea that through your series, I could not only visit one, just general new world, but book after book, new worlds, I really like that concept. Do you have any idea how many books might be in this series?
It's very much open-ended, so it very much goes to how many DAW wants. And of course, with series, you never know. If the sales don't support it, at some point it could end without me getting to the ending of the series. But of course, this is also an era in which, if that happens, I could continue it on my own if I wanted to. I do know how the series ends, more or less, in very vague terms. I kind of know what we're headed to. There's some dark secrets that have not yet been revealed. But in the meantime, it's pretty much open-ended. And so book 3 I'm writing now. It'll be out next September. It doesn't have an actual title yet. In my head, I call it Werewolves and Vampires and Peasants. Oh my, because it's that kind of a world. There are vampires and werewolves and peasants, and this is where Shauna will find herself next. And the one after that, if we get that far, I am currently thinking will be my film noir book, kind of a Maltese Falcon, gangsters and things like that book. So that's all I know about it. I have no other ideas for that plot yet, but that's the kind of setting I'm currently thinking of. That could still change.
Yeah, sure. That's really cool. I have to say, as someone who is very into all that, film noir kind of stuff, I would be very much looking forward to it if you get to that point. So
it might actually give a nice sense of humor, turn out a bit more like a piece of the action, the old Star Trek episode where they find this world that was modeled on this kind of thing. It might actually turn out more like that than Humphrey Bogart. We'll see.
But it's funny that you mentioned that, because that was one of the things I was thinking with Star Trek, particularly Next Gen, but I'm sure other Star Treks as well. They take, the opportunity to jump into different time periods, or, like a Western episode here or something like that there. So, that did pop into my mind as well as sort of.
Star Trek is another one of those, especially the original. I mean, in Deep Space Nine, and then some of the others they kept, and it's more common in TV series now. You have these big overarching storylines that are going on, like The Expanse or something like that. It's one big long story. But original Trek in particular, and Next Generation 2 and Voyager, was very episodic. So it was another way of visiting any kind of world you can imagine. And they found ways to do that within the Star Trek universe. Sometimes they had to rely on time travel, but that's possible in that universe. So yeah, all these kind of storytelling conceits to tell lots of stories set in different worlds is something that science fiction fantasy lets you do that I think would be difficult to do in other genres.
Yes, definitely. And it's something that has been proven to be something people really enjoy. So that gives us a lot to look forward to, really, with this series, no matter how far you get with it. Hopefully it'll be a nice long one, but either way, that is a lot to look forward to. Very cool. So I know that you recently republished now I believe this one actually is meant to be YA, fantasy book Spirit Singer.
Yes.
And that was through Shadowpaw Press, which we talked about it last time, but I'd still like to hear a little bit more about it. It must be pretty cool to be able to take something you published, I think, something like 17 years ago, and has been through at least 2 cover changes, revisions, has been republished, and to be able to take that and bring it into like more of a modern publishing atmosphere. And the cover is super modern. It's really eye-catching. I know you revised it in general, so that must be pretty amazing.
Yeah, and it's one reason I started Shadowpaw Press. I wanted to, like most authors, I have a bunch of stuff that I think should be out there that hasn't found a home yet. And when I talked to a local publisher, she said, well, don't just self-publish it, set up your own publishing house. And that made sense for a couple of reasons. One is that although it's going to largely publish my stuff, I want to be able to publish other stuff. And so the first book I put out was a collection of my short stories, Paths to the Stars, because over my career, I had to publish everything I'd ever had published in short stories. I had to put it in the book, and a few unpublished stories, because I'm not a prolific short story writer. It's just not where I've ended up focusing my energies. And then the second book I always knew was going to be my grandfather-in-law's First World War memoirs. It's called One Lucky Devil. And he had written those late in life in the 70s. And we had the typed up manuscripts sitting around. And I thought it'd be a good thing to get that out in time for the centennial of the armistice last November. So I made that. Great publicity for that. I was on the front page of the Regina Leader Post because of that. And it's got some good attention. And I just felt it was a story that should get out there. So by setting up Shadowpaw Press, I was able to publish that too. And then I just edited that. I wasn't the author. And then Spirit Singer was the third one. This is its third edition. It first came out. I was a way too early adopter of the whole ebook thing. There was a company called Awestruck eBooks, but this was literally books on floppy disks was one of the ways they sold books. That's how long ago it was. And they had a print-on-demand company called, I don't remember what they called it now. Anyway, Earthling, I think that was it. Mm-hmm. Cover was great because I commissioned it from somebody. So I liked the cover, but the printing on that was kind of muddy, and there was no editing done on it at all by the publisher. And And so, it got some awards at the time for best electronically published young adult book, but there weren't that many of us back then. And then it was brought out in a second edition by Tyche Books in Edmonton. And I like that cover more, but the book, was still not quite how I envisioned it in the presentation. It was a very thin book with kind of tight print and everything. And so when the rights became available again, I decided to do it myself. And the cover in this case, I created myself. I found a Shutterstock image that actually fit the book almost perfectly. And so I used that and I did the whole thing myself. And I'm happy with this one, oddly enough. It's funny when you do it yourself, you're usually happy with it in the end. Yeah. And I did rewrite it quite a bit too, not major things, but I did clean up the language quite a bit and tighten up some stuff and fix a couple of continuity errors I had never noticed before until I read it again.
Yeah, I would think that would be pretty satisfying to do something like that. I don't know. I would like to know what it's like for you to look at work that came from about 17 years ago or so and edit sort of your old self in a way. That's how I always look at it. If I find an old piece that I wrote like over a decade or, just forever ago, and I try to edit it, sometimes I can. It really depends on how involved it is. Sometimes if I was really attached to the piece, I have a lot of trouble. I feel like I'm changing a part of my past almost. It sounds like yours didn't need as heavy a work as mine was, that I was looking at, like rewriting the whole thing. But do you feel that at all, or is it really not like that for you?
It doesn't bother me at all to rewrite my old stuff. And in fact, maybe the next book, because the timing has changed now, but I'm working toward bringing out a book called Star Song, which was actually the first novel I ever tried to get professionally published in the 90s. No, 80s. And it came that close. It went to a company called Walker and Company, and the editor there was Josephus Sherman, who was a big name in the field. And when she sent it back and said, you had this big time jump in the middle. I said, you really need to fill in what happened in that big time jump. So I wrote all that. I sent it back. And then I got a letter that said I'd done exactly what she wanted. She was ready to make an offer on it, but the publisher had died. His son had taken over. And the first thing he said was, we're not publishing science fiction anymore. And that was it. And that book never found a home. So I've been editing that right now. I wrote I wrote this in the 80s or around 1990. So that's a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And I found a lot of stuff I wanted to change. I'm a better writer now than I was then. And then just the other day, I suddenly realized that I still wasn't happy with it. And what I really needed to do was to add a whole nother viewpoint character and put that into the story. So I'm rewriting the whole thing now. And so that's why the release of it may be quite some time off yet. Mm-hmm. But no, it doesn't bother me. I've done so much editing of my stuff and other people's stuff through mentoring and writer in residence positions and all that. And especially after a long time, I look at it and it's just like looking at something anybody else wrote and I just fix it.
That's great. I really hope that I get to that point, because there are some things that one particular thing that I'd like to redo, but I have a strange connection to it where like I said, I feel like I'm changing my past. So I at least know that, other people are able and capable of doing it. So I guess it's just a matter of time until I'm able to. So good news for me. Thank you.
Well, it's something I wrote almost 30 years ago is really receding into the past, and I can look at it with a fresh eye for sure.
Definitely, yeah. Now, you did briefly just mention writer residency. So this is something that is just happening. I believe it just started this month for you, and I think it might go through April of next year. Can you tell us a little bit about that? It's pretty exciting.
I'm writer in residence at the Saskatoon Public Library. My first day up there was September 10th, so it runs from September through May, actually, 9 months. And it's a great deal. They pay you with $40,000 and I can say that because that's what they'll tell you if you apply, and they're taking applications for the next year right now. $40,000 over 9 months, and you spend 40% of your time on writer in residence stuff, which is meeting with writers or doing workshops or readings or whatever. And 60% of the time is left to your own project. So it really kind of subsidizes your writing. So it's a good opportunity to focus on something that maybe isn't going to immediately pay that you want to work on. And I have some projects like that I'll be working on over the next few months. It's the second time I've done it. I was public library writer in residence at the public library here in Regina a few years ago. So I kind of knew what to expect. They run it a little differently up there, but it's the same thing. When I was in Regina, I met with more than 70 writers and help them with their manuscripts. Some of them write through a complete book manuscript. They'd come back multiple times and I would help them with them. Sometimes it was short story writers, playwrights, poets, any kind of writing that can show up, and people have all sorts of questions about publishing, and all that. And I do the best I can to help them out. The worst thing about it is I have to drive to Saskatoon and back every week, and it's a 250-kilometer drive, so it's it's 2.5 hours up, 2.5 hours back the next day, and I stay over one night. And it's not the most exciting road, but I know it well already, and I'm going to know it really well after 9 months are over.
Well, that sounds pretty good. Have you ever gotten a question that you just totally couldn't answer? I imagine, we were talking a bit before this that there are some writing principles that are always the same. They transcend genre, or generally transcend genre. But of course, there are some things that are specific to genre. Maybe if you were writing a memoir, that can be a little bit, organized very differently and things like that. Have you ever gotten a question where you either couldn't answer it, or you had to go back and research it or something like that?
I'm pretty good at blathering away when I'm asked stuff. So, if it's something that I'm not particularly strong in, I just make that clear up front. If somebody brings in poetry, I'll say I have a book of poetry, but it's science fiction and fantasy poetry, and they're really stories in poem form, called "I Tumbled Through the Diamond Dust." That one's called. But so I will say I can't tell you what poetry editors at a poetry magazine are looking for in poems. All I can tell you is whether this poem works for me and ways I think it might be better. So I just make that clear up front, and that holds true for everything, even stuff I know really well, like science fiction and fantasy. It's always, I'm just one guy. This is my opinion. There's no written in stone, especially when it comes to writing. There's a million ways to do things, but these are ways I think you could improve this, and it's up to them to take it or leave it. So I've never had somebody come in with something that I just flat out said, I can't help you with that. I've always found a way to help. And if I do have to research something, I have a computer right there, and usually I'll sit there with them and we'll Google stuff, and I'll see if I can find them some resources that might help.
That's great. And I mean, you're a prolific author, so I would imagine that you would mostly have any kind of answer, even if, like you said, you would have to say something like, this isn't my main thing. But still, it's amazing to be able to speak to someone who's written over 60 books, isn't it?
I hope so. There was a writer in residence for a week at my library, and when I was growing up. Well, actually, I was already grown up, I guess, but he was there while I was working at the newspaper in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. And I went in and took a short story to him, and I found it helpful. Yeah. Even at that point, though, I was further along than many of the people that come to me as writer in residence, because I had been writing for a long time. I wrote 3 novels in high school. I had already started sending stuff out. I knew all about proper manuscript format. And this was pre-internet, of course. There was no electronic submissions or anything like that. But even then, he was able to help me with, some things about language and whether the story worked or not. So I hope I'm offering that same kind of service to others. And I try to be encouraging. I mean, people can come in who are at a very early stage, or they're struggling with the basics of grammar and stuff like that. And I still try to encourage them. The only thing you can do with writing is to try to make the next thing you write better than the last thing you wrote. That sort of continual improvement. So I try to help them as best I can.
Absolutely. That's great. And you also have, along those lines, you have a podcast where you talk about creative process, which I'm sure helps a lot of writers as well. It's called Worldshapers Podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I started it at about the same time that Worldshaper came out, which is why it shares the title, because it's also self-promotion. But I've always enjoyed talking to other writers about their craft, at conventions and stuff like that. And those are my favorite panels, have always been the technical ones about specific things about writing and using language. So this was an opportunity for me to talk to other science fiction and fantasy writers. And I have connections, of course, because I know a lot of people in the field. I've met them over the years, or I've known them even before I started getting published, because I met them at conventions sometimes. So I knew I could get some good guests. So I started off, my first 3 were Robert J. Sawyer, Tanya Huff, and John Scalzi, which I thought was a pretty good start. And since then, I've had no trouble getting guests. It comes out about every 2 weeks. It's an hour long. We talk about, they all follow the same format, how they got started, how they got interested in science fiction fantasy, how they got started writing it. And then we talk about some specific book. that they want to talk about as an example of the creative process. And we go through from idea generation to outlining, synopsisizing, the writing process, the revision process, editing process. And then at the end, we talk about big philosophical questions of, why do you write this stuff? Why do any of us write this stuff? And it's just fascinating. Everybody has different writing processes. I've gotten some great answers to that last question. And other big names I've had, Tad Williams and David Brin and Victoria Schwab and Fonda Lee, and just on and on with great guests.
That's wonderful. Yeah, I actually tuned into a particular episode where I believe you were speaking to someone you hadn't necessarily met in person, but I think you either knew or had spoken to in person someone who was their student, then did a podcast with them, and then you spoke to that person, which was really cool. That was
John Kessel, who was the last one that went live 2 weeks ago. There'll be a new one today with a paranormal romance writer, Lisa Kessler. I picked up on him. I'd heard his name, but I hadn't thought of him as a guest. But Christopher Rocchio, who's a fellow Daw author, has a wonderful space opera series that started up. It began with the first one's called Empire of Silence. The second one's called Howling Dark, which is out now. And he was a student of John Kessel's in North Carolina. There's a lot of writers come from North Carolina for some reason. He was a student of John Kessel's, and he praised him. And so then I thought, I'll get him on. And I did.
That's pretty cool. You never know. And I have to say, it's really amazing to listen to a podcast like yours, where you already have so much experience in writing that, really when you're listening, you're learning from both you and the writer who's speaking. And so I can't imagine, we always learn when we do these kinds of things. When I do a podcast like this, I'm learning from you some things I didn't know. And do you ever find that you learn something from the people that you're speaking to? I kind of can't imagine being in the publishing industry for as long as you have and having almost anything left to learn.
Everybody's experiences are different, and everybody has a different approach to the way they synopsize and write. And so it's not so much learning as occasionally I think, no, that's not a bad idea. Maybe I should try that sometime. Lisa Kessler, who's coming on, had met Ray Bradbury and learned from him. And she was writing, and he said, well, how can I get better? And he told her, write a short story every week for a year, and you'll be a completely different writer at the end. So that's what she did. And I listened to that, and I thought, I should have done that, but I'm not doing it now because I don't have time. But there's things like that. And of course, being writer in residence, I can point to some of these things to the people who come in to see me, because now I have this huge, there's 35 episodes, I think, as of today, something like that. 35 hours of interviews with great writers where you can go and listen in, and they will tell you exactly how they create these, in many cases, best-selling works and series and things. So I think it's a really great resource for anybody that wants to be a writer, or anybody who enjoys reading the works of the writers I've interviewed.
Definitely. And sometimes it's just the way something is phrased. It just makes you think differently about something. It's pretty incredible. But if you want to check out that podcast, it is on Ed's site, so you can just go to his website. We mentioned something about a maybe anthology that people shouldn't look forward to yet, but I do want to just bring it up quickly. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, there's actually 2 book projects I want to get out of the Worldshapers. One that will happen, again, when I have time, is basically a book version of the first year's podcast with the transcripts, because I do full transcripts, edited down so there's fewer ums and you-knows and stuff in there, and I get that out. But the other one that's very interesting is I was at the Sask Books Conference, and there was a woman in from Bedside Press in Winnipeg who had very successfully kickstarted a couple of anthologies. And I thought, I have a lot of great connections. So I sent emails out to my first year guests, and 15 or 16 of them, many weren't available or, didn't write short fiction very much, said yes, they would be happy to be part of this anthology. And we're talking like Shauna McGuire and Tanya Huff and David Weber and people like that said they would write a short story for my anthology. Now, it's been delayed a little bit because there was some possibility it might go to traditional publisher, but it doesn't look like that will happen. There aren't a lot of traditional publishers that do anthologies anymore. So I think, again, if I have the time, I'm going to try to make this happen in crowdsourcing of some sort, either Kickstarter or Indiegogo, so that I can make this first year anthology happen. And if it's successful, I will do this with each year's collection of guests going forward. It could be a long running thing if I keep doing the podcast. And right now I have no intention of stopping it. So
absolutely. Well, there's a lot to look forward to from you. So thank you so much for being here, Ed. And can you tell us where everyone can find you after the show?
Yes, I am online at edwardwillett.com. That's just my name, which you can see on the bottom there with a .com on the end. The podcast is theworldshapers.com. I'm on Twitter at @ewillett, and the podcast is on there at The Worldshapers. And I'm also, well, those are the main ones. Facebook, edward.willett is my author page on Facebook. I'm also on LinkedIn, but who goes to LinkedIn for this sort of thing? But I am on there if you look for me.
And it is worth mentioning that if you like what Ed is doing and you're interested in supporting him, he does have a Patreon that you can check out as well.
Yes, you can. And if I get enough people there, I will actually start doing a lot of work on Patreon. Yeah. Right now, it's not quite there yet.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for joining us today on Writer's Showcase. And this has been a copyrighted podcast owned by the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network and Creative Edge Marketing. Our next interviews are going to include Tosca Lee on September 25th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, and also Cassandra Montag on October 1st at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Both of these will be live on Facebook, so make sure that you are on our Facebook, you like our Facebook, and you are getting notifications you can see when we go live and you never miss an episode. We will see you next time.